We have a prospect profile. John's taking the reins on this one. And yes, we are sticking with the cornerback theme here. And John is going to the Pac 12. It is not me doing the Pac 12 work here, it is John. So, Mr. John, who are we going to be previewing this week here for Bengals prospect profile?
Not just a Pac-12 guy, someone who grew up in the Pacific, on the Pacific coast, and chose another Pac-12 school over USC. So don't hold him against him, Anthony.
I won't.
But we're going to talk about Kyler Gordon, who is one of the more fascinating prospects in my mind because of just his journey as a part of the Washington Huskies football team, just his overall experience and what he comes into the NFL with attached to him, because this guy was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school. I think he had a lot of expectations attached to him. And in 2019, he was coming off of his redshirt year, and I don't remember who the other starting cornerback was for that team, but one of them was Trent McDuffie, who was projected to be like a top 16 pick. And there was a competition in 2019 between Gordon and McDuffie to be like that other starting cornerback, and McDuffie won out. So Gordon only started 4 games that year for Washington, and after 2 years there, like he barely played. Like he was a role player or whatnot, but he barely did anything. And then 2020 comes around, it's COVID. The Pac-12 only plays like a handful of games. He only plays 4 games, so he's like 21 years old. He started 5 games after being a 4-star recruit at this great program, and he's got like nothing really to show for it. So 2021 comes around, and he's finally a full-time starter opposite of McDuffie. He plays outside. He plays the slot. I think he finished the 2021 season in the slot. But that versatility, I think, is something that makes sense for the type of athlete that he is. And in this first full year starting, I think he led the team in pass defenses and interceptions over a guy like Trent McDuffie. And McDuffie, I think he's a more consistent player. There's just more stability attached to his game, even though he doesn't have the physical traits as Kyler Gordon. But those physical traits that Gordon possesses, I think, makes him an intriguing option potentially at the end of the first round, because at about 6 foot tall, 194 pounds, the 4.5 240 is not phenomenal, but you're talking about explosion. You're talking about balance and flexibility. The guy almost jumped 40 inches on the vertical, almost jumped 11 feet on the broad. The agility and the flexibility is insane. 3.96 short shuttle, 6.67 3-cone. Like, that's, I mean, regardless of his size, like it's phenomenal. And honestly, I'm looking at his size and I'm looking at those numbers and the fact that he can play inside and out. Leon Hall is like the first guy that I thought of. And I think like comparisons, if you only follow like one team, like I feel like comparisons to former Bengals really helps out the most. And Leon Hall, I think, was a better overall athlete because Leon Hall had like 4.39 speed coming out of Michigan, and he was a little bit longer too. He had like 33-inch arms. So Gordon is not the complete and total athlete that Hall is, but I think for a guy who his like biggest strength is breaking on the ball and like playing in front of him and just having this explosion come out either in run defense or just making plays on some of those short routes and just getting his hands on the ball. Like he may not be the shutdown corner that thrives with his back turned against him, but I look at the athletic tools. I look at just the way that he ascended. I think is very important when you're talking about just his overall trajectory, because just like last year he was the 14th ranked cornerback in PFF's database, like an 87.2 grade after being like 76.8 last year. So the trajectory is going up, which I think is important, especially with the Bengals, and we will get to that in a little bit. But just a freak athlete who I think is only getting better. The fact that he didn't play that much in college, I think, hurts him from being a first-round lock. And I think all of those, everything in that combined, it makes for an interesting projection. Like, I have no idea where he's going to go. I think some people rank him as this mid to late second-round player, but the athleticism and the tools and some of the production, it screams a guy that you would take a chance on if you're there at the end of the first round and the other top cornerbacks are gone. And even compared to a guy like Booth and Elam, who may not be as explosive of athletes, they may have some physical advantages on him, but I think in terms of just the athleticism and just the versatility, what you can do with him in your secondary, I think he might be even more intriguing than some of those other guys in Booth and Elam. So he's really interesting to me. I have no idea where he's going to go, but I don't think it would be too shocking if he's in the conversation at 31.
That's a very good point, and a guy that could go in the 20s, could go in the 30s, could go, in the middle of round two. I don't see him lasting through much more than middle of round two. I think teams would be too intrigued with the athleticism, the value of the position, and a lot of different things. We shared some stats and just a little bit of profile stuff on him. Here's the RAS score, courtesy of Kentley Platt, math bomb there. We love this guy this time of year. You see the 9.68 score that he has here. You see the good composite size grade. You see the elite composite explosion grade there. And then you see the composite agility grade, all speaking to what John just told you about with the athleticism, the athletic profile of this player, elite there, and then a good composite speed grade in terms of the relative athletic score, courtesy of Math Bomb Kentley Platt there. So there are a lot of things that teams are going to like about him. The fact that he played inside and outside, that's a thing that teams will like a lot about him. His size, they will like that about him. The athleticism, they will like that about him. That goes back to a little bit of a roll of the dice, though, because does the versatility of playing inside or outside, does that mean he isn't truly a suitable boundary corner in the NFL full time? And does that hurt his stock? You could look at other facets where he has 2 interceptions to his name, and I know interceptions are not the end all be all of statistics for cornerbacks, but that is something to look at. 2 interceptions over the course of a handful of years. He's a redshirt junior, and those 2 came this last season. Did have 7 passes defended this last season, so you like that, like you mentioned. There is a lot here. And then, of course, John, you have to look at the pedigree that Washington puts out with quality corners. You look at the Trufant brothers. You look at Marcus Peters. You can go all the way back. You want to know who I think I did a little research here. Ray Horton, the old Bengals defensive back who played corner safety in the NFL and coached with the Bengals, was on their Super Bowl team, all that kind of stuff. He was a Husky. So, these are guys that you can look at and say, well, there's a lot of different, they have the pedigree there of a lot of different good players in the NFL. So that also intrigues a lot of teams here. So, I mean, there's a lot to like with this player. It's just, I feel like there's stuff, like you said, there are elements that are more intriguing perhaps than a Booth or an Elam in terms of the athleticism profile, but there are other risks when you're talking about Elam running a 4.39, Gordon running a 4.52. That is a decent difference there. So, I mean, there's some risks associated here, but there are a lot of things to like with this player too.
Yeah, I think the speed is only concerning right now because one of his weaknesses is that he's just prone to some like double moves and fakes and whatnot, and that's not obviously great. You don't want that in a first-round cornerback, and when you kind of get beat on some of those, if you don't have that long speed to recover, you end up just getting burned. Like with William Jackson, I think he ran like a sub 4.40, and he was, even when he was really good with the Bengals, he was also kind of prone to biting on those double moves, but he had the recovery speed to make up for it on those vertical routes where he was beat initially, but then he had the closing speed to eliminate the separation at the end. And maybe Gordon doesn't necessarily have that, which is maybe why some teams may project him to be inside only, like a slot only. But I think the fact that he moved around so much, it also kind of hindered his development too. If they stuck him on the boundary like full time, like with Sauce Gardner, he was consistently, like, he had the same role for 3 years in UC's defense. It fit him to a T, and that allowed his development to just skyrocket as a freshman and sophomore, and then now he's a top 5, top 10 pick. With Gordon, it was just a lot more back and forth, and there was no real stability, and again, not a lot of true playing time. So with the Bengals, I look at him as like, if they have their top prospects off the board, if the worst case scenario happens where there is no T. Higgins available there at the 31st pick, they don't have a guy who they have this really high grade on, like a mid first round grade on, and all those guys are gone, and Gordon is there and he has these traits, and you buy into the idea that he's ascending right now. He's far from like a finished product of who he is,
Right.
even though he's not exactly on the young side. I think he's going to be 23 this year. He's not exactly a young player because he's been in college for so long. But if you feel like 2021 was the beginning of who Gordon is going to be, I think you buy into that potential, and it makes up for the lack of consistency. Because if Gordon is the pick, I don't think that you can write him in as the starter at cornerback. I think Eli Apple's still probably the favorite to win out that job, but that might not be the worst scenario for them if they re-signed him and they paid him enough to be confident in him starting for one more year. With Gordon, I think it's just a matter of getting him reps here and there and then fully buying into him being that starter for 2023 and moving on, because we see this a lot in the free agency, man. They like to buy low on some of these guys and they like to develop them, and they like to buy into the idea that they're only improving from here on out. And I think with Gordon, you can make that similar case.
It's really just kind of betting on some of the elements of the athleticism and the versatility. And you hope that, like I said earlier, that the versatility is actually not a negative, and that, he's not capable on the boundary at the NFL level. But it also shows that he can also line up with, players of different profiles on the opposite team, where, if he's working in the slot, if he's working outside, those are things that are going to, play in his favor a little bit in some teams' eyes too. So I like the player. I like the idea. And this is what's good about, I think a lot of people right now would say, the Bengals really need that starting boundary corner right now that can take over for Eli Apple. And I understand the reasoning there, but this is kind of, this type of pick on this player is what a team in the Bengals position would do, depending on how the board would fall. This is when you're a good team, you're coming off of a Super Bowl appearance. You've done a lot of different things in free agency. There might be some risk associated here, but there's a lot of upside associated with this player here. And this at the back end of the first round, maybe if he lasts into the second round, I would be pretty surprised by that, but I'm going to take my own PSA advice that I that I said a couple minutes ago. But this would be the type of pick that a team in the Bengals position where it would make a lot of sense for them, where you can say that you can develop this guy. There's a lot to like here. There's some risk, but we like what's on paper here in terms of athleticism, versatility, whatnot.
Yeah, and you definitely want to bet on those guys with that athleticism baked in. Like, those guys aren't getting quicker and any faster, especially for the guys who are now 22, 23. And that's a lesson that I learned with T. Higgins, because he tested at 20 years old. He didn't test really, really well, but some guys are still maturing and growing. Also, I just want to cite my source. Like, I kind of took that Sauce Gordon nugget from Mike Renner of PFF. I just want to make sure I wasn't plagiarizing there, but that he was the guy who originally said that. So love you, Mike.
Where are you seeing him potentially go? Are you seeing a team potentially being enamored enough to take him in the late teens? Do you see him lasting beyond the mid-second round? That seems to me where he's got a really wide scope of where he could potentially go, at least as we sit here right now, a couple weeks before the draft. He's not a blazer with the 40 time, but he's also not slow by any means. There's a lot of athleticism there, as the RAS score denotes. The PFF pass defense score last year was pretty high. I think it was 89.6. So, there's it shows some capability there. I don't know. What's your gut telling you in terms of where this player may go?
Man, like, it seems that someone that athletic can't escape the first two rounds, but that's exactly what Joseph Ossai did last year, which is why the Bengals probably pounced in that scenario. He could go at the very end of the first round. He could go all the way to the third round. Like, honestly, it feels like everyone is all across the board with this guy. So in all likelihood, I think he's gonna land like early mid second round range. And if the Bengals do trade back in that range, like, that's probably the ideal spot to take him. You wouldn't get that fifth year option, but you probably get better value for him because, again, he's not a finished product.
Yeah. I'm trying to do some homework here in terms of, and granted, it wouldn't say exactly who he was necessarily matched up against here, but unfortunately I'm looking at Drake London, the
Mm.
USC wide receiver, one of the best in this year's class, to see how he had matched up and how he performed against Washington. Unfortunately, it's looking between his injury last year, COVID shortened 2020, and him, not playing every game in 2019. I don't think there's much there in terms of potential stats from London. I'll do a little more homework on that, but it doesn't look like Drake London, again, one of the top wide receivers from USC in this year's class. Not much data there in terms of how he performed against Washington, unfortunately, in these corners. So again, Kyler Gordon, a guy along with Trent McDuffie, two exciting corners in this year's class out of the University of Washington, and a lot of upside there, a lot of versatility there, a lot of athleticism there, but an element of risk in some ways as well.
That's usually how it goes for some
It
of those
is.
picks at the end of the first round. It's not always going to be T. Higgins, but I think you made a good point. Like, they're going to desperately hope it is, and I think they're going to stay put and see how the board falls to them. And I don't think, again, Gordon is one of the guys that they're really hoping falls there. That just might be someone that they kind of more or less settle on, but that might not be like giving Gordon enough credit because he's got a lot of positives attached to his resume as well.